much of the shoreline structures are falling apart. The wood has been eaten by gribbles and shipworms. The metal's been corroded. It's all about the same age. Concrete has been corroding and just being destroyed by ice, freeze, thaw. So we have an opportunity to change a lot of the harbor shoreline structures at this kind of critical moment. And it's very gratifying that there's so much interest in doing something that's more ecologically responsible. The workshop that we held early on in this process developed a number of ideas which made their way through the design process to the final result. We broke into 3 or 4 groups.
What kinds of things can you do there? Can you sort of like walk around in leisure, or can you actively engage with the river or with other people around you?
Yeah, we're just answering this question. What would you like the Harlem River edge to look like? Trees, different colors.
And maintaining structure and history.
Basically,
right now,
we're dealing with the edge.
The edge. This is what you're dealing with today. And this is the area that was just described as the edge.
This model represents this little piece here and a piece of the rocky slope.
So basically it's like a wish list. And the whether or not you get it.
Well, what do you want it to look like?
Slope. You want to slope down to the river, soft edge. Okay, remember, it is an edge, so we have to keep in mind that the utopian idea of these huge, like a tennis court, is probably...
This was what was being described just now as the edge. This is the pedestrian access to the existing pond.
In that little middle section that is set back, is it because the seawall deteriorated, or was it always just...
The riffraff that you see there is natural. We always were able to go down to the water's edge.
This is the highway behind it, and this is the park space, and this is the seawall that you see here.
So you're actually talking about an edge that creates a community around it, not just a natural community, but an educational and a public community.
Numerous people requested that there be an expression of the history of East Harlem. So in the process of developing the designs, we had discussion about whether that could be artwork or something else.
Public art is essentially art that's designed to engage with the public. When people see public art, they engage with it. They see it as something that has a vitality that communicates with them and who they are as a community. But we're looking at ways that something can be placed in that space that commemorates maybe the community in some way, essentially an aspect of the community that people can feel that the space belongs to them.
One key idea was that there would be some sort of terracing and steps down to the water.
And then the stairs that you're talking about would continue down there.
That's how people got back and forth to the water.
We had in mind that there would be some portions of the water's edge which would have these terraces or steps that you could walk down to a shallow water environment. Here we go.
The southern half has this cove, and the cove right now is a revetment cove, revetment meaning a boulder edge, a slope boulder edge, and what we would be doing is putting a little terrace area within the revetment so that it would be like steps down that you could sit on and walk down. And there would even be steps that you could use to launch a kayak or a canoe. So we have a number of setbacks for the tide pools, one right here, one right here, and then these other little setbacks here, here, and here, where the gabions actually step back and then we can plant salt marsh grasses within the crevices of the rocks and the gabions. And so that creates even another type of ecosystem, which is a salt marsh. This is the cove with the boulder revetment. And within the revetment there would be cut block steps so that people could walk down or sit down on the steps.
It's small in width, and the shoreline portion of it is small in part because the overall park needs to accommodate a bicycle path, which is 12 feet, and it connects to a bicycle path to the south and then to the north. Not only is the traditional shoreline straight edge broken up with these sort of inlets, but there's actually a change in the shoreline elevation so that they function like a tide pool, so that people can get close to the water. It's the real water, it's really the river water, but it's a very shallow environment, and you know, you can possibly be getting swept away from it.
When you have tide pools, you can come along and see the animals and the fish which are trapped at low tide here, but then when the tide comes back up, they're washed back or re-submerged. So there might be a possibility that we could build in a way to get people close to the water without being dangerous by thinking of tide pools.
Light is a major controlling factor in the biology of what lives in the water. Plants, of course, need light, and so the algae in the light-rich zone, the upper part of the water body, where the light can penetrate, green plants can grow, and things that eat green plants will be there as well. And so as we started to look at more images, Ricardo developed that into the design of a space which is lined with, which has porous gabions underneath, but is lined with an impervious stone dish, essentially, in the place where you want to hold the water. And this is kind of the first of its kind,
yeah.
Adding a different experience to our urban waterfronts.
Just to show that the tide pool is made of a lot of these rocks put together. And what actually holds the water in place in the tide pool is an underlayer of clay. There will be a clay lining that'll keep the water in the tide pool, so that when the tide goes out and there's water left, like 2 or 3 inches, it will stay there, it won't percolate. And that will keep it as a habitat for certain types of shallow water critters.
Stevens Institute turned out to be very intrigued by this idea, so we created these models, physical models, that were tested in the wave tanks and coordinated with the Webb Institute to find an alternative wave tank when theirs went down, because they were intrigued by the ideas and wanted to bring some of this understanding forward beyond just this one project. What's going on today is we are getting a chance to see how waves interact with those shorelines, how the shoreline interacts with the laminar flow, or the flow that goes north and south in the Harlem River alongside the shoreline, how that varies according to what the shoreline looks like. Yeah, that's okay, I guess. Okay. Yeah. This represents the gabions, which would be stacks of boxes of rocks and oyster shell, especially in the lower part, so that oysters would get attached all over the place here. And this is the tidal pool, which is impervious and which would hold water at low tide. So when the tide goes out, water should sit up here. And it's cove-like, so that the water moving by at high tide gets into this system instead of shooting by on the vertical. One of the things that I've been attempting to do with some of the alternative shorelines is figure out a way to get the water to slow down so that sediment can fall out of the water. Instead of roaring along and scouring, we'd actually be building mud banks and shoreline habitat. So one of the other things we'll be looking at is what happens in terms of eddying and turbulence along the different shorelines. So we do this with dye dripping into the water and watching how the shoreline reacts as water moves along it by observing the dye and picking it up on a computer program. This is an example of the velocity test showing dye in the water. As this is being pulled through the river, we can see that the dye is pooling, collecting and pooling and slowing down in the this cove or tide pool area. So it confirms our our hope that we in fact can expect sediment to build up in here, and shoreline intertidal species that collect in there during the low tide will be in an environment which is suitable for them. It's a marine grade plastic. It's flexible, but it doesn't degrade in salt water, and it doesn't degrade in sunshine. In this case, we're going to be using a combination of rocks with shell in order to attract shellfish to attach there and create a living crust of filtering shellfish.
We actually combined a couple of systems. We're going to be using the plastic throughout, and then right in the front, we're going to combine it with a stainless steel mesh as well. So we'll have 2 meshes in the front, and then we'll have about 14 inches back inside the gabion, not exposed to people, another plastic baffle.
And at the top, I'm expecting that the plants, I hope that the plants will take off and thrive and fill in and make a living green surface over the gabion so that you really won't even see them very much. When we went out to look at the shore in the field, he identified a number of critters, including some crabs and fish and so on, that were an indicator of the type of ecosystem that is thriving there.
In a location like this, near the shore, tides do play an important role, and they influence our access to the shore and what you can see there. So that provides a region called the intertidal. That's the region between where the high tide is, where the water is at the high end to the low end. When the tide goes out, it allows access to that.
There's a way that these gabions will kind of be self-reinforcing by attracting plants to grow in them, and the roots will hold the soil, and the shellfish themselves as well will also reinforce it.
I think we would have preferred not to have a barrier, at least in the cove area where there was where the revetment kind of stepped down. But where there's a drop-off and where the bikeway comes pretty close to it, I think it's probably a necessity.
I think safety is a big issue, and I think that that's something you can build in different ways. If you have stairs going down, there's nothing that says there can't be a gate. You know,
yeah,
some
right.
gate, so that if an adult wants to go through with their child, right, you can make that choice.
But see, then you can make it a more natural surface of defense.
Right.
Like maybe different boulder style, right, and then have like the plants you want to incorporate, maybe different style that's like a little bit more appealing out of the water.
Right. Oh,
and
absolutely.
then it's a natural barrier. People don't feel like they can't go in, but it's not like a certain amount of feet high, so this way people don't fall over and.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think you need some kind of thing, and even if it's a gate, you can have plants growing on it, so it doesn't look like a fence. Right. You know, you can make something really beautiful.